Good morning. Today is the 25th day of Kislev, the first day of Hanukkah, and the 8th of December. And we're continuing with mitzvah Tzitzit. So we explained about the large encompassing circle, and this idea that all circles are the same. So if you get any inkling of encompassing light, he says here, in a sense, you've received all of it. So when you put on your talis, and you have some sense of encompassing light, it's as if you're accessing, and again, it has to be as if, because we said that in this world, encompassing light is not really revealed. But you get an inkling of it from wrapping yourself in the talis. Vinyana Tzitzit. So now, you see where we're? On page 16. Vinyana Tzitzit. Let me see. Can you find it for me? Yeah. בעניין הציצית שהשערות דמוחין דאבא ואימא שבזה המאירים לנוקבה. So we said that the threads of the tzitzis that we tie on the corners, on the four corners. And remember, we said that the four corners in Hebrew, I think we said this, the word corner, we had this verse from Isaiah, "Velo yikanef od marecha." That corner means concealed. That this world is a concealment. We always say the four corners of the earth. What in the world does that phrase even mean? If the earth is round, why would you say that it has corners? Because corners means the four extremities which conceal godliness. Meaning that if you look at the full expanse of the earth, there are four ways in which godliness is concealed in this physical world, and then there's two more, which we call above and below. They also are not corners, but they're extremities also, and that is the source of vak. That is the source of the six emotional attributes. In any case, so the fringes, the threads, represent, we said, the Abba ve'ima, meaning the Chochmah and Bina, the wisdom and understanding of Zah, of the small continents, which are now going to be given to Nukva. Nukva is the feminine aspect of Zah. And Nukva usually symbolizes the way that reality is, meaning that from Zah, which is more abstract, something does enter into the physical, realistic world. So now we have to explain this. העניין יובן בהקדם קושייה אחת בדברי האריזה. To understand this, we have to begin with a question about something that the Arizal said. כי הנה, בדוך דייטוב המבואר בעץ חיים, דמוכין דנוקבה נמשכים מני הידזה. It says in many places in Etz Chaim, which is the authoritative version, or it's not really authoritative, it's one that's accepted. It wasn't even written by him, but it's one that's accepted by the learners of Kabbalah, that this is what he said from Rav Chaim Vital, through Rav Chaim Vital. It says there in many places that the mind, again, Nukva is a partzuf, it's a persona, so it has to have a brain also, meaning an intellect, sorry, not a brain, it has to have an intellect. That its intellect is taken from the three lower habitual sfirot of Zah, of its masculine counterpart. In other words, they're called Netzach Hod Yesod. They're the habitual sfirot within the emotional realm, the realm of the torso, let's call it. We have three purely emotional sfirot, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, loving kindness, might, and beauty. And three that are habitual, meaning they build habits. They build the way that the person acts. Now, it doesn't have to be action in action. It could be action in thought even. Okay. In any case, Zah's Nehi, the three habitual sfirot of Zah, are what become the mind, the intellect of his feminine counterpart. Let's see. One way of understanding this is, we learned the Maimer not long ago in Chayei Sarah from Torah Or, not you and me, but in my Friday night shir. So there he says that the Braitot in the Talmud are higher than the Mishnah. What does he mean? He means to say that first the Braitot, chronologically the Braitot came first. What are the Braitot? The Braitot are...
Chronologically, came first? This was all Tanaic material.
Right.
How do you date it?
Oh, because the Braitot were the actual Tanaic material.
And then he redacted?
And then Rebbe redacted it as the Mishnah.
No, he chose.
No. He redacted it. We don't have a Braita like the Mishnah. There's no Braita that's exactly like the Mishnah.
That.
Okay, so they're earlier.
Oh, so you're saying he rewrote rather than
Yeah, he had to rewrite.
That's not what I understand.
Because you see that they're
they're simpler. Okay.
Not just simpler. So that's first of all.
They're more.
They present the disputes, and there's no disputes in the Braitot usually. The Braitot usually are from one school of thought, either Rabbi Akiva or Rabbi Shmuel. And in the Mishnah, you'll find Rabbi Meir says this. He was the disciple of Rabbi Akiva, and you'll find that there's another opinion. The Chachamim.
They say it was redacted rather than.
When you say redacted, what do you mean?
He chose.
No, you choose and you collect.
Okay.
It's a manner of expression. Anyway, so the Braitot, what are they? He says in this Maimer, the Braitot are the actions that you're supposed to. They're like a Shulchan Aruch in a certain sense. This is what people knew. This is like we know. You do this, right? You do what does a regular Jew know? He doesn't remember what it says in the Shulchan Aruch. He remembers how you do things. Okay? So that is the mind of Nukva. My mind is based, my intellect in the day-to-day life is based on the habits I've collected. I don't remember the source. Why is it this way? Most people don't remember. They just do because this is how they're used to doing things. So habits become your mindset. That's the way of usually explaining this. It's the same thing is true when you go even higher. That Abba and Ima also give their nehi to Za. Okay, the personas of father and mother also give their nehi, their habitual powers to Za to become his intellect. What is that? So we usually say that is that the parents think that they're transmitting knowledge or a mindset to their children, whereas what they are not aware of is that they're transmitting habits to their children. Children don't learn from my mindset unless I really, really explain it.
It's into the action.
The action becomes their mindset. The way I act at home, that becomes the next generation's intellect. So this is true in every succession of Partzufim. Every time that the mindset goes down, it comes from the Nehi. And it's even explained in their result that the Nehi, the habitual Sfirot, they become the two eyes of the Partzuf that's underneath. Meaning that they're like, because it obviously goes through what you see. In any case, so that's what's usually written. That Nukva, which is underneath, it's considered to be underneath Zah, so it receives its mind from Zah's habits. It's a common thing. But here we just said that from the very essence of Zah's mind, the small countenance's mind, his chokhmah and bina, his wisdom and understanding, these fringes come out, and they directly influence the mindset of Nukva, of the Partzuf of the feminine. So that's very difficult. Okay? It's two different explanations. Well, today we wouldn't say it's two different explanations. Why? Because today we know there's many things that influence the mind. It's not such a big mystery. But in the Arizal's mindset, it is a mystery. If you explain this and you explain that and you don't explain how they work together, somebody 500 years ago when the Arizal wrote would not understand what he had said. He would understand it as contradictory. Why? Because we're used to the fact that you're influenced by many different factors. They didn't see the world this way as much. Obviously the Arizal did. He himself did. But the people who was teaching, certainly the people that were learning, found this as a problem.
You mean the Metzias was
very simple.
Yeah,
it was
right,
much simpler.
Right, of course.
By else, it's not such a big mystery. Yeah. So now he's going to say, "Achinem vuar b'makom acher, ve'em begadata derabi bna have mitzayin ma'arata." But explain somewhere else, and where is it somewhere else? He says there's in the one of the sections of the Arizal, one of the books that was written from the Arizal's teachings is called Ma'amrei Rashbi ve'Razal. the teachings of Rashbi and the sages, and here he's referring specifically to the Talmud pieces that are authored by Rashbi and by all other sages. And there's a story there about Rabbi Bna, who is in some cave. Okay. And there the Rizal explains this in length, and here he says like this: "Dכל עיקר עניין השערות הוא, כשההשפעה הולכת בדרך דילוג גדול ממהות למהות אחר שאינו מערכו כלל." So remember, we said about the beard that the beard is like a short. It's like a it's like a ma'akaf. How do you say ma'akaf? No, ma'akaf. It's a bypass. It's like a bypass of the neck, which is considered to be narrow. So you have hairs, and the hairs are supposed to carry the message around the narrow straight. It says in general that's what hairs do. Hairs represent an influence when it doesn't go directly, but rather it skips over something. Bederch dilug gadol, a great skip over something. Mimahut lemahut acher she'eno me'erko klal. When you have to reach something that is completely different from the origin. In other words, there's a gap, and the only way to get over it is somehow to jump over it. And that's what hairs do. They allow you to jump over gaps. What kind of gaps? We're not talking about physical gaps. We're talking about categorical gaps. Meaning, the way that Za thinks, the way that the small countenance thinks, and the way that the Nukva thinks are so categorically different that you can't influence one from the other directly. You have to create some kind of bridge, some kind of jump. It's not even a bridge, it's not permanent. It's just, it jumps. From time to time, it jumps over this. It jumps over this gap. אזי לא יוכל לקבל כי אם דרך שערה לבד, שהוא עניין צמצום השפע ביותר, והתלבשות הערה מצומצמת זאת בלבוש גס ועב כמו גוף השערה, לגבי ניקת מותרי מוחין שבחלל, כדי שאז יוכל לקבל כת הערך לקבל. And the difference here is, as a categorical difference, is that one is very mature and the other is very young. And remember we said this about the way that the sages talk. The sages always talk to us in riddles, or at least in metaphors and aphorisms and in allegory. And the reason they do this is because the way their mind thinks and the way our mind thinks, there's a huge categorical gap. So the only way they can get it across is by giving us a short idiom that then we can go with, and we think we've gotten everything, but that's called a hair. So an idiom or an allegory is like a hair follicle that's taking the essence of what the teacher understands and giving it to the student, so at least he has it, but then he has to understand what he has is a very, very contracted and short and terse and even sometimes indecipherable for him version of what the teacher was thinking. So he says that's what the hairs do. They allow a connection, but the connection by necessity is going to completely contract the mind of the original in order to bring it to the destination. So here in this case it's the same thing. ומזה לנוקבה שהם קרובים בערך תקבל השפע מגופו דזה שהם בחינת נהי שבו. The connection between Za and Nukva in general is close enough that they can have a connection through their Nehi, through Za's habitual. So there's a connection through the body itself, through the kidneys themselves. And there you could say it's like a transfusion. It's like you're connecting one person with another person and you're transferring the blood itself. That is that type of connection, he says. And because they're close, the small countenance is feminine aspect, and he himself, so there can be a transfusion from a direct connection between the habitual sfirot of Za and the intellectual sfirot of Nukva. אבל מה שנמשך ממוחין דאבא ואימא בנוקבה, הן למד בית נתיבות, I think I skipped. והעניין כי המלכות הוא בחינת, sorry, אבל ממוחין דאבא, that's what I want. אבל ממוחין דאבא ואימא כשהעירו בנוקבה. But to get the chachma and bina, the wisdom and understanding of Za to be caught in Nukva itself, על ידי התלבשותם במוחין דזה, לא תוכל לקבל שפע, כי אם על ידי בחינת השרות. She can't receive directly. There the difference is too big. So what's he saying basically? He's saying there's a habitual connection between the male and the female, but there's not an intellectual connection. What is he saying? He's saying men and women get along, if you take it, like generalize, they get along when they do things. But if they have to see eye to eye, it's much more difficult. Much more difficult. Because there's a gap. There's a very big gap between the way that the male mind works. Everything is different.
Everything is different.
So the only way that he can give something to her, again, I'm giving a parable. The Arizal never talked about men and women. He talked about Zah and Nukva. But in any case, if you try to see it, it's not that difficult. That men want something, one thing, and women want something completely different. And so their intellect is structured differently because it's serving a different aspect. Even when you're talking about the divine soul, there are pronounced differences between the way that men see God and the way that women see God. Completely different. That's why we say that by men, the most important thing is the feeling of nullification before God. And by women, the most important thing is connection to God. Two completely different aspects. Completely. If you don't understand this, it's very hard to understand why women do what they do. Like, you can't understand their religious aspect. And you don't understand what's good for men. You're afraid to start making men connect to God. Not a very good idea. None of this connection stuff. You need nullification before God. You need to submit before God. Something completely different. But again, if you say that to a woman, you tell her you need to nullify before God, that's terrible for her. That's not the way she sees God. She sees God as something you connect to. Okay. והעניין כי המלכות הוא בחינת דבר השם, ורוח פיו המחיה נבראים מאין ליש. It says the reason for this is because Malchus, the Nukva, is the word of God. It's considered to be the word of God. Here's how it's so different. But you can understand if Nukva is the word of God, now you can understand the saying that the sages said, the 10 measures of speech came down into the world, not speech, but of discourse came down into the world, and women took 9. Because they are the aspect of God's speech, as it were. V'ruach piv, and the spirit of his mouth, and it gives life. In the same way that Eve was called the mother of all life. So she wants to give life. She sees God as a source of life. That's why I said she wants a connection with him. When you want to nullify before someone, it's not because he's a source of life. It's because he's a king. It's something entirely different. We'll see in a second. ומוחין דנוק והנמשכים מנהיד זה, היינו בחינת החוכמה שבדיבור, איך ומה להשפיע. And her mindset is always the question, now that I have a connection with someone, what should I give them? Or what should I give them in order to form a connection? It's always a question by the nukva. Again, this is all within the male also. So my nukva is my speech, and its mindset is what should be said and what should not be said in order to connect to others. That's where the mindset of the nukva in me is, in every person. So, we went very far. We went and said this is male and female. But if we tone down the distance we went and we come back closer to what he's saying here, it just means that the nukva means in me, in each person, the mind of what to say. Now, if you don't understand that the speech has a separate mind, then you haven't spoken enough. Because it's very interesting. When we speak, we don't think. We have to contemplate our speech to begin to think reflectively on it. We have to stop speaking. It's very hard to think while you're speaking. So where are you speaking from? So there's an understanding. It's a different mind. It's a different mind altogether. It's an intuitive mind that you say either things that you've already, remember habits? We talked about habits. The habits become the mind of I like always to mention Churchill, but there's many people like that. They can only say something impressive because they've rehearsed it 1,000 times before. It's become a habit for them. You have to make thinking into a habit. That's what it's saying. It's saying that if you want to be able to speak intelligently, you have to go through a process of making your thought a habit. You can't think through it now and then say it. Most people can't think on their feet when they're talking. Okay, so we'll discuss this more next week. Chanukah Sameach.